As a formality, Kunal Basu lives in Oxford and is a professor there and comes to Calcutta on and off. He has written 3 novels, and his short story, Japanese Wife, was made into a very beautiful film by Aparna Sen. We all have seen that. He's currently writing a novel based in Calcutta, in contemporary Calcutta. Churni is a very talented actor we have in Calcutta who's been acting in many films, many of them by her husband, has won awards. And right now, Shabdo, which is running in the city, has won the National Award for the Best Regional Film. She plays a psychologist in it. This afternoon is something we have been doing now for almost a year in association with Prabha Khaitan Foundation, Siahi, T2 and She Cements. Thanks to everyone. And before we begin, I'll ask Mohan, the general manager of the hotel, to just welcome Kunal and Churni. Over to the floor.
That is what makes my work even more difficult, because he needs no introduction. So I don't know where to start. The first time I saw this man was on screen, actually, when I was mesmerized by the play of kites against a blue sky in The Japanese Wife. A very lyrical film made out of a story written by Dr. Kunal Basu. And there he stood in the crowd. He walked in the crowd, but he stood tall. So how was the experience there?
You mean as an actor?
As an actor, yes.
Well, it was a very hot afternoon in Kalighat. And those of us who've been to Kalighat know that it's impossible to walk around, let alone shoot. But I was passing through Kolkata. I actually did not attend the shooting of The Japanese Wife much. Maybe it been 3 or 4 days of shoot. But I showed up for that one. And it was complete mayhem. You people in films understand all of this. People, assistant directors were screaming on top of their voices, and crowds were sort of peeping into cameras. Opposition was losing her temper. And suddenly I was told by her, "Why don't you go and change?" I said, "Me change what? I think my clothes are all right." She said, "No, you got to change for a shoot." And that's when I knew that I was in for some trouble. So I went and changed, and she asked me to do this role of knocking into Rahul. Now, this man is a rugby player. So I told him, I get to knock you, but you don't get to knock me back.
That was the deal.
Yeah, that was the deal. So that's how sort of my small little cameo came about. Yeah.
And you also, you were also interested in theatre. As you said, you performed and you trained under Utpal Dutta?
In People's City Theatre. That was a brief period when I was unemployed. And I'd come back.
Okay.
I'd come back from America after I finished my master's, and I had no clue what I would do. Absolutely no clue. Because I did not want to do the boring 9-to-5 thing. And so I started writing film reviews and book reviews for The Statesman. But in those days it paid like 40 rupees for a review. You just couldn't put body and soul together. You couldn't date anybody seriously with that kind of money. And so I acted with People's Theatre, PLT with Utpal Dutta for about 2 seasons.
That's quite a lot.
Yeah. And then decided I needed to have a profession which would be the least disruptive. I needed to find a job. And remember, we're talking the 70s and 80s. We're not talking the brave new India of the 21st century, when people can have careers in the arts. Thank God, they can have career in media. In the 70s or 80s, you either became a doctor or an engineer, or you died on the streets. Okay? And so I thought I needed to find a job which would give me the time to do what I want to do in the arts. And I said, well, why not become a professor? So that was the sort of my bright idea of which these days doesn't sound very bright to me.
Would you really say that you went in for a master's in engineering just so that you could date somebody? No?
Was
it out of interest or compulsion?
to do a master's in engineering. It was a funny decision because when I finished my bachelor's in engineering, which was a mistake to start with, I had again no clue what I would do. I usually am clueless about the next step in life. I had an offer to do, I had a scholarship to do a master's in America. And I said, look, Kunal, you're a middle class Bengali boy. Who is going to give you money to travel around the world? Nobody, right? And this is an opportunity for me to go and travel around the world. A master's I could do, you know? And so that was a calculated risk I took to go into a master's and in the bargain travel around the world, which I did. Okay? And so then I sort of came back.
Would you say that you live in that world for the time that you write a book?
Yeah.
You live in that world of those characters, you know, that is where, I mean, so until you get it out, or until you get that on paper, or work out what's happening, or where these people lead you, or what is it that the people you create want to do in your work? I mean, you're actually creating an entire society there.
It is like, Stanislavski, the famous theater director, said, coined the phrase method acting, right? That you have to live that role, live that life to bring it out. I remember when I was writing The Miniaturist, which is my second novel, set in the Mughal times. My entire palate changed. I would only have kebabs. With a biryani on the floor, I put on weight. Listened to a lot of Nusrat Fateh Ali Khan, traveled to Eastern Turkey, to Iran, and to other places, following the trail. And then at the end of it, there is sadness, because then I need to leave that world and walk away. Because I never write sequels. I would never write sequels. So there is an element of immersing yourself in the world, which you have to do with caution. Because the novel that I'm writing now, the protagonist is a gigolo, and I have no interest in joining the profession.
What is it about the Orient, tell me? I mean, there's the Japanese vibe, the Yellow Emperor's Cure.
And my first novel, The Opium Club, yeah.
The Opium Club,
Yeah.
yes. So there's China, there's Japan.
Yeah.
What is, I mean, what is it that fascinates you?
It's Hemendra Kumar Rai. When we were young, we grew up with Hemendra Kumar Rai. Jokhet Don, Abar Jokhet Don. And he would have these stories, amazing stories, about piracy in the South China Seas. And about drugs and opium stored in warehouses along Kidipur. So when I was very young, my mother used to sort of, for a long time, kid me saying, when you were very young, and we used to ask you, what do you want to be when you grow up? And I would say either one of these three: Charlie Chaplin, okay, a Tibetan monk, or a smuggler. And why smuggler? Because the heroes in Hemendra Kumar Rai's novels for kids were smugglers who took daring risks on the South China Sea. So I think my romantic persona, if you wish, had sort of strong overtones of the Far East, which I hope is now wearing off.
I have a question that, every writer feels very grieved when their book is translated into a movie and it's not the way it's written and it's not translated in another way. Did you feel that with Japanese Wife, or did you feel that they kept the characters and kept the story?
I didn't feel aggrieved at all. A couple of reasons for that.
Yeah.
I think with the filmmaker, I felt that there was correspondence at the level of sensibility.
Yeah.
I realized this, and I will grant you this, that books and films are not the same thing.
Yeah.
They cannot be. A film is not just a story. It is not just a story. So it's a filmmaker's take, it's a filmmaker's leap using a certain narrative framework, a certain theme of event. And I don't begrudge any filmmaker who does that. I'd be excited if a filmmaker took a gist of what I had written, not the whole story, okay? A gist of that story, and like a musician, like a classical musician does bistar on it, engaged in that. I'd be excited by that. I'd be curious to see what happens when my small little bit of creation enters into somebody else's mind. So my starting point is not one of antagonism. Many authors, and I've had long conversations with Salman at one time, Salman Rushdie, who felt that it's me, Midnight's Children is mine. How can I ever let anybody intrude into that world? He did, at some point, right? And it's not about intrusion. it's about co-creation. It's about, filmmakers understand this a lot more than we authors. Authors tend to be more protective. I'm not. I'm open doors. And so that helped. But also equally, for that particular story and that film, I felt that the basic sensibility was the same. Okay? And that basic sensibility is important to me. And if that works, film is the filmmaker's film, it's not mine. The Japanese Wife, the film version is Aparna's film, it's not mine.
Yes, because sorry, please. No, but just taking off on these lines. Often it's my experience that when I have read a book first and have loved it, the film version looks scanty and not well done.
No, it could be the other way around also.
No. Often, I said often. Often. I'm speaking
A
of
lot of
the
good
side.
films can be made from B-grade novels and vice
Exactly.
versa.
No, yes.
Sunil Ganguly apparently did not like foreign anything that's here.
Yes. No, he had long correspondences about this. Yeah.
No, shut up. But it does happen sometimes. I mean, which is why I use the word often, because with the Japanese Wife, I thought that I loved both versions. So that is a rare situation,
Since you say that your thinking is very cinematic when you write, so are you already planning, or are you open to writing original screenplays in the form of a screenplay instead
I'd
of
love
a
to.
novel?
Yes, I would. I'll tell you only what my major limitation is. My major limitation is that I'm a careful writer. It takes me time. Okay, and the things that bubble in my head, I'm forever thinking of stories, and I stop myself and say, Kunal, you have chemical imbalance in your brain. You're always. I'm serious. I think about a story a day almost, and most of it is unreadable, okay, and should not be written. And I said, forget it. It's bad, okay. But I'm always making up stories, and so it's important for me. And many of these are, I think, in my eyes, I see as cinema. So let me use this difference. A novel, a full-length novel, is like an affair, a serious affair that engages the heart. Okay, and a serious affair that engages the heart should last about 2 years. Great if it lasts more. Okay, but it should last at least 2 years. Otherwise, it's not worth the effort. It's not worth all the lies. It's not worth everything. Okay, so if I think of a story and I can tell myself, I can live with this for 2 years. I will not be bored. Okay, and I will drink and breathe and live with it. Then it's novel material. A short story is a one-night stand. Okay, and if I can think of a short story and say, well, this has a fleeting excitement. Okay, then I will write it as a short story. A film is fascinating because it has both. Okay, it has the excitement for one-night stand. It has the tug of a full novel.
Kunal, when we read your the book, The Japanese Wife, as well as we watched the movie, I felt that it was devastating to watch a love which was so full, at the same time it was unconsummate. Unconsummate, why? Because the two protagonists never met. But at the same time, the love that existed between them is so unbelievably, realistic and true. So I wanted to ask you this question for a very long time, and I didn't know that I would be meeting you, because I watched the film, then I read the story, and I howled. I must admit it to you, I really cried, because it touched a chord somewhere. And in a way, it gave us hope that if a love like this could be thought about, it has to exist, that it can't just be a fiction. So I wanted to ask you, when you thought about these two protagonists, what came to your mind, or do you know, or are you aware of somebody like them? Or was it just a figment of imagination? I wanted to know how real it is.
I'll tell you how I thought of the story. We were chatting just before this, and to me, and we discussed this, the most difficult question for me to answer, honestly, is why did you think of this story? Or any other stuff, right? How did you think about Onu Ranavu? How did you think about Bhute Bhushan? Wow, I felt like strangling him after I saw that. Why didn't I think of this? Why did he? why didn't I think of these stories that you guys have done? The Japanese wife for me was, this is how it happened. About 25 years ago, when I had no interest in writing, when I was a political activist, okay, from the left, and I was out in the, it sounds a bit odd, right? You need to qualify. You need to qualify. Not this left, but the left then. Okay. And I was out in a village. I was traveling with a friend, a comrade of mine, and we was waiting in a ferry terminal. And he pointed out a middle-aged gentleman and said, "You see this man? He has a Japanese wife." Now, in a city like Kolkata or any urban place, it's not unusual to find somebody with foreign spouses. Okay. But in a village in Bengal, and that to a Japanese wife, not Angrez. I mean, the Brits have been coming and marrying our men for years. Okay?
Oriental.
But, Orient, yeah. To my credit and my great good fortune, I had never asked any follow-up questions at that point. How did they meet? I mean, does he speak Japanese? I mean, does he go to Japan? Does she come? Do they have kids? What language do they speak? I didn't ask a single follow-up question. 25 years later, on an evening of snowstorm in Montreal, I sat at my desk and wrote the story of the Japanese wife. With the snowstorm raging outside the window. And I don't know why. This is the most difficult question to answer honestly. One can always recreate and say, I wanted to think about two characters who are in love, but great intensity of love, but no domesticity. I can make up this stuff. But it comes with a good idea or a worthwhile idea comes organically.
If I'm not mistaken, in your Anandavajar interview, you mentioned that you were planning to write a story or novel in Bengali.
Yes.
Yeah. Now, this is a follow-up question. Is that with your kind of background and most of the Indo-Anglian writers have a certain kind of background. You can most definitely write in Bengali too. Now, would you choose your language? I mean, given the options, you could write both in English and Bengali. Depending on the subject, let's say if you are dealing with a character, middle-class Bengali character in Kolkata, would you then switch to Bengali? What would decide the language that you're writing in? Secondly, the follow-up question is that in a film, I personally have a bit of a problem with a character talking in a language which is not his natural language. Let's say Bengali Jomidar, suddenly speaking in Hindi, I'm making the film in Hindi. Let's say a Sharat Chandra adaptation or whatever. He's very clearly would not be speaking in that language naturally. But if I were to make a film in Hindi or in English, with novels and stories, you don't have a problem about reading about someone in a different kind of a language. But in films, and particularly if it is close to you, even with Namesake, I was having this problem constantly.
It is a fascinating question because, absolutely fascinating question. I'll tell you why. Because, there's some cultures where there is a natural language. Okay? So think about Sweden, a country I go quite frequently. I've got publishers in Sweden and things like that. I've worked there to do, etc. It is the national language. Okay? In the US, it is the national language. It's English, although there are dialects and differences and stuff like that. East Coast, West Coast, you know very well. What is the natural language of India? Depends on the kind of story that you're telling, right? So for Snehomay Chakraborty in Sundarban, the national language is Bangla. So if Snehomay broke into Hindi, it would be problematic. If he broke into, even if he diverted from Dokhno, it would be problematic, right? But suppose we were telling the story of urban people in Kolkata, okay? We are the only truly bilingual species on earth, okay? Not the Quebecois, who think they are bilingual because they can speak English and French. We Bangalis are the only truly bilingual species on earth, okay? And no matter where we have grown up, we've got these two streams interacting inside our head. And we break into this, we break into that, okay? So if that is your milieu, then it's natural for that person to be speaking that way. If that is not your milieu, then bringing in different sort of language streams would be problematic. It would be problematic for you as a filmmaker, it would be problematic for me as a novelist. Now in novel, the issue of language gets a further twist. When I was writing The Miniaturist, Ramchandra Guha, who's a good friend of mine, you know Ram. So Ram's wife asked me this question in Bangalore. She said, well, how are you going to write dialogue for these people? I said, what do you mean? Well, they are the 16th century inhabitants. Okay, they speak in Urdu, which is a new language in India at that time. Okay, it's a new language just born, and you're writing this novel in English. How are you going to write? Okay, it's an interesting question, but this is how I resolved it. My view on my take on that was, look, I need to write in the essential language of people. So if father looks towards son and say, I want you to do nothing but practice your sketching from morning till night. It's a novel about artist son. Okay? That's how a painter father would instruct his or her son today, would instruct his or his son in the 16th century. So I would write in essential language, which cuts across the natural languages of those places. But the most important thing, and this is where the skill of a novelist comes in, and I don't know whether I have it, although you read it in English, you will be able to hear that language or traces of that language. Okay. So I would have wanted to write The Miniaturist in the Urdu dialect of English, just as I wrote The Japanese Wife in the South Bengal dialect of English. There is no artificial dialect. I don't believe in doing artificial dialect, but it's inside, if you read it, you should be able to hear that. You know? The people say that why don't you do glossaries? You know? This is where Amitabh and I part company. Okay? That I do not want to write in a way with inventing a kind of English which is typical of the times. Okay? I want to write in today's language, essential language, but somehow try to evoke the internal language. It's a fascinating question. And this is something you guys in films grapple with, and you find your own resolution, and we have to grapple with too. Bangla and English. It's a good question. The plot, again, is driven by a concrete project. You see, because I'm not a literary theorist, when I think about writing, I have to think about concrete projects. What is my book? What is the story? Who are the people? Okay? The story that I thought I would write, and it may change because we're still some years away from writing that, I'm still a few years away from writing the novel, is set in the Northeast. It is about a retired IAS officer who has lost his wife. A wife that he dearly loved, and they've spent, 40 years married, and they have one child who lives in America. Okay. And he, in some sense, his life comes unhinged. He can't find his medicines anymore. Okay. From that point, he doesn't, in many ways, he almost forgets how to speak, because he's used to speaking to his wife in a certain way, and there's nobody he can speak in that language. He can't share that language. And he goes and finds a place for himself. It may be Peling. I actually quite like Lower Peling in Sikkim. Okay? I wanted to actually build a hut there and live there, except Shushmita, my wife, is not too keen. Okay? And he goes and lives there. But the people around him are the locals, and there's an insurgency, as in the Northeast. So that's the story I wanted to tell. About this man who lives in isolation, and his great passion, because he has all the time in his life, his daughter who lives in America, tries to get his father involved. Baba, do something. What are you doing here? You're getting bored. Do something. So she brings along a telescope set. And says, read some books on astronomy. You've got clear skies here. You can look at the stars. So at night he sets up and he looks at the stars and he follows in of that. Okay? That's his life. So this novel is. I want to write this in Bangla. Okay? So although the context is non-Bengali, the world through which I see this story is an intensely Bengali world. And I will write it in Bangla.
What time do I reach?
সাউথ ইন্ডিয়াতে সব অরিজিনাল করেছিল, সব ডিজিটাল করে। কি হয়েছে ঝামেলাটা? আছে গাড়ি কানাল, আই ক্যান ড্রপ ইউ রাইট।
নন্দনে পৌঁছে
ছেলেবেলা পড়েছিল ওই